She placed the wedding ring on his desk with both hands steady. Quiet and completely broken inside. 23 people had laughed the night he brought her home. Now one of them had forged her name on a stolen document, and she would not spend another minute fighting to prove she was not the thief they always believed she was. "I will not stay," she said, "where my poverty can be used as evidence of dishonesty." Nathaniel Ashbourne looked at the ring on his desk. Then he pushed it back. "Before we go further, if you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to welcome you, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel, follow Rose's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." The carriage stopped in front of Blackmere House at 8:07. Rose Mercer knew the exact time because she had been counting the minutes since they left the inn, the way she always counted things when her nerves were threatening to betray her. Minutes, footsteps, candles on a table, anything with a fixed number that she could hold on to. She had not been told what to expect. That was the first mistake Nathaniel Ashbourne made with her. Not the last, but the first. He stepped out of the carriage, turned, and offered her his hand with the same composed efficiency he likely used to sign contracts. Rose took it. She descended onto the gravel drive and looked up at the house, and for one unguarded moment, something moved across her face that was not quite awe and not quite fear. It was recognition. So this is what a real house looks like, she thought. From the inside of one, she had seen Blackmere from the lane before. Every person who passed through the parish of Thornwick had seen it. The house sat at the top of a long rise of manicured ground. 3 stories of pale Yorkshire stone, with windows that caught the last light of evening and threw it back like an aristocratic refusal to go dark quietly. She had never imagined walking through the front door. Nathaniel offered her his arm at the entrance. His face told her nothing. It rarely did. "They are already assembled," he said. "Who?" "My family. Several guests. There is a dinner." Rose stopped walking. He did not. She had to move quickly to stay beside him. "You did not tell me there would be a dinner." "I mentioned it." "You mentioned that your family would be present." "You said nothing about 20. The front door opened before she could finish the count in her head. Light poured out, voices. The particular sound of a room full of people who have been eating and drinking for an hour and are no longer pretending they are not curious about what is coming through the front door. A butler materialized from nowhere the way good butlers always did, silent, correct, and utterly unreadable. He took their coats. Rose instinctively thanked him. The butler blinked. She caught the blink. She catalogued it. Later, when she thought about that evening, she would remember that blink as the first sign that this house was not accustomed to its guests noticing the people who served them. The dining room was down a corridor that smelled of beeswax and money. Rose had learned, in her years at the charitable women's institution, that money had a smell. Not gold itself. Gold smelled like nothing. But the rooms where wealthy people lived smelled like wood that had been polished for generations, and wax that had never been allowed to run out, and fabric that had never gone threadbare in a draft. This corridor smelled like all of those things, and something underneath them that she could not yet name. She named it 3 steps into the dining room. Fear. Not hers. Theirs. 23 people turned when Nathaniel entered with a woman none of them recognized. Rose saw the sequence of it, the polite turn, the social smile, the moment of expectation, and then the very specific stillness that overtakes a room when what enters it is not what was anticipated. She had been in rooms like that before, on the other side of the equation. The charitable women's home had visitors, sometimes wealthy benefactors, who came to see how their donations were deployed. They always had that same stillness when they walked through, and found themselves looking at real poverty for the first time. A different kind, not expected. This was the inverse. The room had expected Beatrice Vale. Rose could tell by the way several women's eyes moved to the doorway behind her, as if checking whether someone else was still coming. No one else was coming. Nathaniel stopped at the head of the table. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. It was the kind of voice that assumed it would be listened to. And it was always correct. Julian, Lydia. He looked around the room. This is Miss Rosamund Mercer. She will become my wife on the 28th. In the years that followed. Rose would replay that sentence many times, listening for what it contained and what it lacked. It contained her name, the date, the fact of the marriage. It lacked explanation, apology, the word please. She understood later that the lack of apology was the most generous thing he could have offered her. An apology would have implied she needed one. What followed was silence. Then Julian Ashbourne laughed. He tried to stop himself. He pressed 2 fingers to his mouth the way a man does when he's at a formal dinner and doesn't want to seem impolite. But the laugh was already out. It had already moved through the room. Lydia Ashbourne turned her face sideways. Her shoulders moved. Her hand went to her napkin. And then Octavia Ashbourne, the Dowager Duchess of Blackmere, 60 years old, dressed in gray silk that cost more than Rose had earned in 5 years, smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who has decided the situation is so preposterous that embarrassment would be a wasted emotion. Nathaniel, Octavia said. Her voice was perfectly level. Is this a jest? You cannot be serious. I am always serious. Mother, you have complained of it since I was 12. Octavia looked at Rose directly then. Not the way one looks at a guest. The way one looks at a piece of furniture that someone has placed in the wrong room. Where does your family reside, Miss Mercer? Rose had known the question was coming. She had rehearsed an answer in the carriage, something deflecting. Something that would buy her a moment's grace. She had the rehearsed answer ready in her throat. I have none, she said. Julian blinked. You mean they have passed? No, Lord Julian. Rose kept her voice even. I mean, no one knows who they were. The room went so quiet that Rose heard the candles. She heard the exact moment when Julian Ashbourne understood what she was telling him. Because his expression moved through confusion, comprehension, and something else, something sharp and satisfied. The look of a man who has just received a gift he hadn't known to expect. Nathaniel's orphan was not merely common. She was a foundling. Nobody put in front of a room. Nobody from nowhere. No family, no money, no name, no connection, no claim to anything whatsoever, except whatever claim Nathaniel Ashbourne's inexplicable lunacy had just bestowed upon her. The contempt that moved through that room was quieter than the laughter. And far more dangerous for it. No one offered Rose the empty chair. That was the moment she would remember most, not the laughter. Not Octavia's marble smile, the empty chair. It sat beside Nathaniel's place at the table 24 places set. 23 of them occupied. The chair had been prepared for someone. It even had a small embroidered cushion on the seat. Someone had placed a cushion on that chair and assumed that whoever sat in it deserved comfort. Nobody moved it toward her. Nobody said, "Please sit." They simply turned back to their food and their conversations with the collective ease of people who have decided that the interruption is over. Rose stood. She stood for 4 full seconds, which was long enough to understand precisely what was being communicated. Then Nathaniel pulled the chair out himself. He didn't look around the room when he did it. He didn't make a pronouncement. He simply pulled the chair out from the table the same way he did everything, as if the matter were decided, and he had not thought to ask anyone's opinion. Rose sat. She picked up her napkin. She placed it in her lap. She looked at the table in front of her and identified, with the quiet automatic precision of a woman who had spent 3 years working in a charitable institution's accounts office, that the cutlery arrangement was different from what she had expected. She started from the outside and worked in. That was what you were supposed to do. She knew that. She'd read it. But knowing something from reading it, and knowing it the way these people knew it, the way their hands moved without thought, were 2 different kinds of knowledge. and in the time it took her to make the decision about which fork to begin with. She saw Lydia Ashbourne notice. Lydia said nothing. She simply watched. And then something happened that Rose had not planned for, had no protocol for, and could not have predicted. A young footman, 18 at most, with red ears and an expression of concentrated terror, was moving around the table with a wine decanter. He was too focused on not being visible, which is always what makes a person clumsy. His elbow caught the edge of a guest's chair. The decanter tilted. Red wine arched sideways and landed across the tablecloth 3 inches from Octavia Ashbourne's plate. Not on Octavia. The footman froze. In the charitable women's home, when something like that happened in the dining hall, a supervisor would be called. Someone would be made to clean it. Someone would receive a formal record of the incident. The footman might lose part of his week's wages. Rose did not think about any of that. She moved. She was out of her chair and kneeling on the carpet before she had fully decided to do it. Her napkin already pressed against the spreading edge of the stain at the base of the tablecloth. The footman was staring at her. Everyone was staring at her. She could feel the stares the way you feel a change in temperature. She looked up at the footman. "It's all right," she said quietly. "Fetch a cloth from the sideboard. Don't rush. Rushing makes it worse." The footman blinked exactly the way the butler had. Then he moved. Rose stood. She was aware of the wine on her own sleeve. She was aware of Octavia Ashbourne's expression, which had traveled somewhere beyond contempt into a kind of baffled horror. She was aware of Julian's barely suppressed satisfaction. You see what she is, and she was aware of Lydia's face, which had gone very still and very young in a way it hadn't been before. She was also aware of Nathaniel. He was looking at her. Not with embarrassment, not with the calculating assessment she had grown used to in the month since he had appeared at the charitable institution's accounts office door and asked her, with minimal preamble, whether she would consent to be his wife. He was looking at her the way a person looks when they have just seen something unexpected that confirms, rather than contradicts, what they already believed. She sat back down. She smoothed her dress. She picked up her outside fork. Octavia found Nathaniel in his study after dinner. Rose was not there. She had been given a room, not the best guest room. Rose had noticed the particular placement of it immediately, and a housemaid who had volunteered nothing and responded to questions with monosyllables. Rose had thanked her anyway. The girl's expression had been almost alarmed. Study. Nathaniel stood at the window with a glass of brandy he hadn't touched. He heard his mother come in. He didn't turn. "You will reconsider," Octavia said. "It was not a question. I won't." She kneeled on the floor. "Nathaniel, in front of our guests. She prevented a stain from setting in your tablecloth. She behaved like a servant." He turned then. "She behaved like a person who was not afraid to be seen caring about someone frightened." A pause. "I found it instructive." Octavia stared at her son. She had the expression she wore when she was calculating whether an argument was worth the energy. Her parentage is not a moral failing. The world does not share your philosophy. The world is frequently wrong. I've observed this more than once. He set down the brandy. "She will marry me on the 28th. I would prefer your blessing. But I have made peace with proceeding without it." Octavia moved to the door. She paused with one hand on the frame. "I will tell you something. Nathaniel, you may dismiss it, as you dismiss most of what you don't wish to hear." She didn't look back. "This family has survived 3 generations of bad harvests, 2 generations of poor political choices, and 1 catastrophically expensive war. It has survived because we understood the value of alliance, connection, and pedigree. She has none of those. And neither your admiration for her practicality, nor whatever you imagine she inspires in you, will substitute for them." Nathaniel said nothing. Octavia left. In the quiet that followed, he picked up his brandy and finished it. Then he picked up the evening's correspondence and found, beneath a letter from his solicitor, a note from the charitable institution in question. a routine account summary he had requested 3 weeks ago. He had been reviewing the institution's finances in connection with a bequest from his late aunt. The numbers were in Rose Mercer's handwriting. He recognized it now. Orderly, nothing wasted, including space on the page. He put the summary down. He thought about the footman's face, the terror on it. And then the way it had changed when an unexpected voice said, "It's all right." He thought about what it meant that a woman who had been brought into a room and laughed at had spent the next 2 hours thinking about a frightened 18-year-old rather than about her own position. He thought about his estate, and the ledgers Crowther had been presenting him for 15 years. And the particular way Crowther always smiled when he delivered good news. He thought about judgment. He had told her he needed someone with judgment. He was beginning to understand that was a significant understatement. Rose met Nathaniel in the small sitting room, adjacent to the library, the following morning. She had slept poorly. The bed had been extremely comfortable, which she had not expected to be a problem. She was not accustomed to comfort. And it had kept her awake for an hour, the way silence keeps awake someone who has grown up around noise. She was composed when he arrived. She was always composed when it mattered. It was a skill she had built the way you build any skill. Through extensive practice and from necessity. Nathaniel sat across from her. "I should have told you about the dinner," he said. She nodded once. "You should have." He seemed to have expected either dismissal or upset. Her agreement appeared to catch him slightly off guard. It was a small crack in his composure, the tiniest seam, and she filed it away the way she filed most things. Carefully, without yet knowing whether it would prove useful. "I want to explain the arrangement more clearly," he said. "Please." He folded his hands. He spoke like a man reading from a document he had composed beforehand. Which she suspected was exactly what he'd done internally. Blackmere Hall requires management of a kind it has lacked for some years. The social demands of the household require a duchess. I require a woman whose judgment I trust with the household staff, accounts, and domestic expenditure. In exchange, you will receive the security of the title, the use of Blackmere's properties and resources, and independence from the institution where you have lived for 23 years. He paused. I believe this represents a practical agreement that serves us both. Rose was quiet for a moment. Is that all? She asked. I believe it covers the material components. And the immaterial ones? He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I respect your abilities, he said. I intend to treat you accordingly. Rose folded her own hands in her lap. She thought about the empty chair. She thought about the 23 faces. She thought about what it meant that this man who had brought her into that room without warning, who had watched his family laugh, who had pulled out her chair with the efficiency of someone executing a practical decision, had still brought her into that room at all, when he could have simply not told them until after the ceremony. He had chosen to put her in that room. She wondered what that meant. She decided she didn't have enough information yet to conclude. All right, she said. You accept? I accepted in the letter. I'm simply restating it with more information than I had at the time. She looked at him steadily. I should tell you something, Your Grace. Nathaniel. I should tell you something. Nathaniel. She tested the name carefully. She rarely used people's given names. It felt like a liberty she had never quite earned the right to take. I am good at household accounts. I am good at understanding where money goes and why it goes there, and whether it should have. I am good at managing people who feel unseen, I know. I am not good at being in rooms like last night. He was quiet. I can learn the forms, she said. I have been learning forms my entire life. But I want you to understand what you are asking. It is not simply that I don't know which fork. You started from the outside, he said. You got it right, she stopped. Lydia was watching, he continued. I was watching as well. You hesitated for approximately 3 seconds and then you made the correct choice. Rose stared at him. You watched me count the forks. I observed you so small problem under considerable social pressure with no instruction and no allies. He paused. It was not a failure. It was a demonstration. Another pause. And then something moved across his face, something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. The only failure of the evening was mine, for not preparing you. The silence between them lasted long enough to become something. Rose looked away first. There is one more thing, she said. Yes, the servants have not been paid in 6 weeks. Nathaniel went still. The footman last night, the one who spilled the wine. He has new shoes, but he's been walking on them carefully. The way someone walks when shoes are borrowed. The housemaid who showed me to my room last night has hands that have been cracked for some time without proper treatment. The laundry maids in the corridor this morning. She stopped. 6 weeks is long enough that people start making calculations about whether to leave. Nathaniel was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. How do you know it's 6 weeks? He asked carefully. I don't know for certain, Rose said. I'm estimating from several indicators. I could be wrong. He said nothing for a moment. You are not wrong, he said. Then where's the money going? It was the question that would define the next year of their lives. Nathaniel didn't answer it, not because he didn't want to, but because Rose could see from the quality of his silence that he did not yet have the answer. That was the second thing she filed away. And on the 28th, at a small parish ceremony attended by Julian, who did not bother to conceal his displeasure, Lydia, who looked at Rose with the clinical assessment of an examiner, Octavia, who wore black mourning, Rose thought, or a statement, probably both, and Beatrice Vale, who stood near the back and watched with an expression Rose would spend a long time trying to categorize. Rose became the Duchess of Blackmere. The ring was too large. It had been Nathaniel's great-aunt's. Whoever had worn it last had possessed considerably bigger hands. Rose noted this with the calm of a woman who had spent her life wearing things that didn't quite fit. She held her fingers together and the ring stayed. Octavia found her before the wedding breakfast ended. The guests had moved from the ceremony room to the adjoining hall. And in the shifting of positions that happens when a crowd changes locations, Rose found herself briefly without Nathaniel, standing near a window with a glass of something that tasted like very sweet wine. Octavia appeared beside her. She did not lower her voice. She did not bother to look away from the room. My son may put a ring on your hand, Octavia said. He cannot put generations into your blood. Rose held her glass. She thought about the 6 weeks of unpaid wages. She thought about the footman's borrowed shoes. She thought about the estate accounts, which she had not yet seen but intended to request within the week. She thought about what she had said to herself, in the carriage. On the way to the dinner she hadn't known was a dinner. I have survived everything else, I will survive this too. She looked at Octavia. Then I suppose I shall have to give him something else, she said. Octavia looked at her, finally and directly. What? Rose looked toward the window, toward the enormous pale stone face of Blackmere House. A future, she said. She finished her wine. She went to find her husband. They were 2 days out from London when Rose asked to stop the carriage. Nathaniel had arranged a private coach for their journey north. It was a better coach than Rose had ever ridden in Wellsprung, with clean upholstery and a foot warmer that actually worked. She had been alternating between looking out the window and reviewing the household inventory documents Nathaniel had provided her, reading the pages in the particular way she read financial documents, not from left to right, but from the numbers outward. Something in the inventory had caught her attention. She asked to stop at the side of the road. Nathaniel stopped the carriage. Rose got out. He followed because there was nothing in his experience with her to suggest she did impulsive things without reason. She stood in the November wind on the edge of the London to York Road with the inventory document in her hand and looked at a line item. Candles, she said. Nathaniel waited. According to this inventory, Blackmere Hall purchases 340 candles per month. At current prices, that represents, she did the arithmetic in her head without apparent effort, approximately 12 shillings per month above what a household of Blackmere staff size would typically require. Assuming standard use. Nathaniel looked at her. It's probably nothing, she said. It might be an older pricing agreement. It might be that the house is simply kept very brightly lit. She folded the document and looked at him. But it might be something else. What else, he said. I don't know yet, she paused. 12 shillings per month is not catastrophic. No, but a person who inflates candle expenditure by 12 shillings, Rose said quietly, probably inflates other things too. The wind moved across the road. A horse from a passing cart briefly looked at them. Nathaniel said, Crowther has managed these accounts for 25 years. I know. He managed them under my father. He has my complete... I know, Rose said again gently. I'm not accusing him of anything. She looked at the document. I'm simply noticing something that doesn't quite balance. She got back in the carriage. Nathaniel stood on the road for a moment longer. Then he followed. In the carriage, Rose returned to the document. She turned to the next page. She found two more things that didn't quite balance. She folded them away. She looked out the window at the November sky, cold. Clear, enormous, the kind of sky she had rarely had occasion to notice. Living in rooms and corridors and account offices for 23 years. She thought about what it meant to be a duchess. She thought about unpaid servants. She thought about Silas Crowther, whom she had never met, who smiled warmly in the account Nathaniel had given of him, who had served 3 generations faithfully and received complete trust in return. She thought about all the things that balanced perfectly. She thought, perfect balance is easy when you control the numbers on both sides of the equation. Outside the window, England moved past bare trees, cold fields, tenant farms that she could not yet name but would spend the next year learning. Name by name, family by family, the way she had learned everything else in her life. From the outside in, with nothing to rely on but attention. And time. The carriage moved north, Rose kept reading. Blackmere Hall arrived at dusk. Rose didn't need to be told they had reached it. She felt it in the way Nathaniel straightened almost imperceptibly in his seat. The way a man straightens when he is approaching something that holds both his pride and his burden. She looked out the carriage window and saw the outline of it against the winter sky, enormous. Austere, the kind of house that had been built to impress people who were already impressed by most things. She was not impressed. She was calculating. The drive alone told her something. The gravel needed raking. Not urgently, not catastrophic. But it had been a week at least since anyone had attended to it. A small thing. The carriage stopped. The door opened. A footman appeared, a different one from London. Older, steadier, and handed her down. She thanked him. He blinked. She was beginning to understand that thanking servants was the sort of thing that unsettled people here. And she was beginning to understand that she was not going to stop doing it. Nathaniel was beside her immediately. They walked in together, which was the first small mercy of the day. The housekeeper met them in the entrance hall. Her name was Mrs. Pennington, 53 years old. Rose guessed, built like a woman who had spent 3 decades refusing to sit down, with a ring of keys at her hip that clinked when she moved. She curtsied to Nathaniel. She curtsied to Rose with a half-second delay that said everything about where her loyalties currently resided and how much work Rose had ahead of her. Your Grace, she addressed Nathaniel. The East Wing has been prepared. Dinner can be ready within the hour. Thank you. Mrs. Pennington, Rose said. The housekeeper looked at her. Not rudely, but with the particular measuring stillness of a woman deciding whether this new arrival was going to be a problem or an ally. Of course, Your Grace, she said. The keys clinked as she led them forward. Rose listened to the keys. She was already counting. The first 3 days at Blackmere Hall passed in a controlled kind of quiet. Nathaniel managed the estate calls and tenant meetings that had accumulated during his time in London. Rose moved through the house the way she had learned to move through any new institution. Slowly, attentively, and with a great many questions. She did not demand, she asked. There was a difference. And the servants noticed it within 24 hours. She asked the cook how long the kitchen had been managing with one working oven. She asked the senior parlor maid what had happened to the third housemaid who'd been listed in last month's staff inventory. She asked the stable groom carefully, without making it feel like an interrogation, why the carriage horses had been reshod with cheaper iron than the records indicated. Each question was received with a version of the same expression. Cautious surprise, a pause, and then slowly an answer. On the morning of the fourth day, Mrs. Pennington found Rose in the small records room off the estate office, working through a stack of household ledgers that she had requested the previous afternoon. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, "you might have asked Mr. Crowther for those." "I know." Rose didn't look up. "I wanted to see them before I spoke with Mr. Crowther. I find I understand conversations better when I've read the relevant documents first." She turned a page. "Please sit down, Mrs. Pennington." A pause. The housekeeper sat. "The 3 maids who left in October," Rose said, "were their wages current when they left?" The silence that followed was the most informative Rose had encountered since arriving at Blackmere. "Mrs. Pennington, 2 of them were owed partial payment," the housekeeper said. "Finally, 3 weeks. I settled it from the household emergency fund and noted it as a coal delivery." Rose looked up. "You paid them yourself?" "Someone had to." "How long has the emergency fund been used that way, Mrs.?" Pennington's jaw tightened. She was a proud woman. Rose could see it in every line of her and pride. For a woman who had spent 30 years making someone else's house function, looked like this, a refusal to complain, and a terrible compressed dignity in the face of being asked to account for things she should never have been left to manage alone. 7 months, the housekeeper said. Rose set down her pen. 7 months, she repeated quietly. "And Mr. Crowther's records show full payment throughout." "Mr. Crowther manages the main accounts. The household accounts are my responsibility." "Yes," Rose said. "I understand that. I'm simply noting that 2 different sets of records currently tell 2 different stories about where the money goes." She paused. "Does His Grace know?" The housekeeper looked at her with an expression that Rose would later describe to herself as exhausted loyalty. The expression of a person who has protected someone they care about from a truth for so long that they can no longer remember what the truth looks like without the protection. "His Grace has had many demands on his attention, Mrs. Pennington said carefully. "He does," Rose agreed. "He will have fewer in this area going forward." She closed the ledger. "I want to see every household expenditure record for the past 18 months. Not the copies filed with the estate office, the originals." Another silence. Then Mrs. Pennington reached into her apron pocket and produced a folded paper. "I've had them ready," she said quietly, "since the morning after you arrived." Rose took the paper. She looked at it. She looked at the housekeeper. "You knew I'd ask. I hoped you would." That was the moment Rose won Mrs. Pennington. Not through authority, not through cleverness, but through the simple act of asking the question that should have been asked 7 months ago. She unfolded the paper. She began to read. Silas Crowther arrived at Blackmere Hall on a Thursday, as was his custom. He had arrived on Thursdays for 25 years. He had a particular way of arriving, brisk, organized, radiating competence that Rose had been told about by Nathaniel and had constructed in her mind based on that description. She had built him as a type. She knew the type. She had met a version of Silas Crowther in every institution she had ever passed through. The person who had been there longer than everyone else, who knew where everything was, who made themselves so thoroughly essential that the idea of questioning them felt almost impolite. She had also noticed, in every institution she had ever passed through, that those people were frequently the ones worth questioning most. He walked into the estate office, saw Rose sitting at the desk with several of his account books open in front of her, and stopped. "Your Grace," he said warmly. "What a pleasure. I had hoped to introduce myself properly. I trust the journey north was comfortable." "Very," Rose said. "Please sit down, Mr. Crowther." He sat. He arranged himself with the ease of a man who had sat in that chair several thousand times and considered it, in some important sense, his own. "I see you've been reviewing the accounts," he said. "Pleasantly. I'm delighted to answer any questions." "It can be rather overwhelming at first. The estate finances are somewhat complex." "They are," Rose agreed, "though less complex than they appear." Crowther's smile didn't waver. "How do you mean?" "Presentation's complex," Rose said. "The underlying pattern is actually quite simple." She turned one of the open books toward him. "This is the timber account from last January. The purchase record shows delivery from a Yorkshire mill at a price approximately 14% above the regional rate for that period. Timber prices fluctuate, they do, though they typically fluctuate downward in January, when transport is difficult and sellers are motivated." She turned to another page. "This is the March grain account, again above market rate. This is the September salt account, above market rate. This is the October candle account, Your Grace." Crowther leaned forward with an expression of gentle patience. "I understand that to a fresh eye these variations can appear concerning. But I assure you, each of these suppliers has a long relationship with Blackmere. Long relationships command premium pricing, but they also provide reliability. They provide the appearance of reliability," Rose said quietly. "I've written to 2 of these suppliers." A very small pause. "I sent the letters before we left London," she said. "Responses came yesterday." She reached into the folder beside her and removed 2 letters. "The first supplier confirms they have provided goods to Blackmere at standard market rate. The discrepancy between their invoiced rate and the rate recorded in your accounts represents approximately £40 in the last calendar year." She placed the letter on the desk. "The second supplier has no record of several deliveries listed in your accounts at all." Crowther was quiet. His expression had not changed. That was the remarkable thing. A lesser man would have reacted, flinched, reddened, reached for an excuse. Crowther simply went very still, the way a man goes still when he is calculating, and waited to see how much she knew. "These are serious allegations," he said at last, quietly. "I haven't made any allegations," Rose said. "I've asked a question. The question is whether these discrepancies represent administrative error or something else. And if it's administrative error, then we will find the error and correct it." She met his eyes. "And if it's something else, we will find that too." Crowther stood. He was still composed, still pleasant, still Silas Crowther, who had managed Blackmere's accounts through 3 dukes and 2 monarchs, and every financial storm in between. "I think," he said carefully, "that His Grace would want to be part of this conversation." "His Grace will be part of it," Rose said. "I intend to speak with him this evening." She closed the account book. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Crowther." He left. Rose looked at the closed door for a long moment. Then she looked down at the accounts. She had shown him 2 letters. There were 4 more she hadn't mentioned. That evening she told Nathaniel everything. She had waited until after dinner, when the house was quiet. They sat at the same table where, 3 nights ago, they had eaten in the specific silence of 2 people who are still learning whether they can speak to each other without performing. She laid the letters out in order. She explained what she had found. She did not editorialize. She did not accuse. She simply presented the information the way she had always presented information. Clearly, sequentially, and with the evidence attached. When she finished, Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. "Crowther has managed these accounts for 25 years, he said at last. "I know. He managed them under my father. He stopped. My father trusted him completely. I know that too. You're suggesting that he has been systematically defrauding this estate for—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Rose said carefully. "I'm telling you what the documents show, and that the explanations he offered this afternoon don't account for the discrepancies." She paused. "What you conclude from that is your decision." Nathaniel looked at her. She could see it in his face, the particular internal conflict of a man who has trusted someone for a long time, being asked to consider that the trust was misplaced. It was not a pleasant thing to watch. She had seen it before. In the charitable institution, when a well-liked supervisor turned out to have been skimming food funds for 2 years. The people who had trusted them always looked exactly like this. Not angry, not immediately. First grief. "He's been here longer than I have," Nathaniel said quietly. "Yes, he knew my father. Yes, and you've been here 4 days." The words landed without cruelty. But Rose didn't flinch. "That's true," she said. "I have." She folded her hands on the table. "I understand why that makes this more difficult to hear. I'm not asking you to act without more evidence. I'm asking you not to dismiss the evidence that already exists." Nathaniel was quiet again. "Then the servant's wages." 7 months, Rose said. "Mrs. Pennington has been covering the gaps from the household emergency fund and recording it differently so the estate records don't flag it." Something moved across his face then that wasn't grief. It was harder than grief. It was the expression of a man who has spent years believing his house was in order, confronting the possibility that it was only in order because the people who cared about it were quietly breaking rules to make it appear so. "I'll speak with Crowther," he said. "He'll have a good explanation ready," Rose said. "He's had time to prepare one, I know." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not dismissing your concerns, Rose. I'm asking for the opportunity to conduct this conversation myself." She nodded. She believed him. She almost entirely believed him. She kept the remaining 4 letters. 3 weeks into January, Rose made her first major mistake. It happened simply, the way most real mistakes do not in a moment of recklessness, but in a moment of overconfidence dressed up as practicality. She had identified that Blackmere's winter grain supply was being purchased from a contracted supplier at a price that could be significantly undercut by a smaller mill she had located through correspondence with another estate manager 20 miles south. The saving would have been considerable. She negotiated the contract, authorized the purchase, and arranged delivery. The grain arrived damp. Not obviously damp, not wet, not visibly ruined. Damp the way grain gets when it has been transported in winter along a route she had not adequately researched. Packed into wagons that were not properly sealed against road moisture, because the smaller mill did not have the transport equipment the established supplier maintained. A third of it spoiled within 10 days. The financial loss was real. Not catastrophic, not to an estate the size of Blackmere, but real enough to matter. And real enough to be noticed. Julian noticed within the week. She was not sure how he had found out. She suspected Crowther. She had no proof. By the time the story reached London, the orphan duchess thinks running a duke's like counting potatoes. It had been sharpened into exactly the kind of blade that a man like Julian wielded best. Factually accurate at its core, surrounded by a frame that made accuracy feel like mockery. The evening after, she received a letter from a London acquaintance relaying the joke back to her. Rose went to the grain store herself. She stood in the cold and looked at what remained of the spoiled supply. She had been calculating margins and supplier relationships and transportation routes. And she had made a correct calculation about the price and an incomplete calculation about everything else. She had not known what she did not know. That was the worst part. She was standing there in the January cold when she heard footsteps behind her. Nathaniel. He didn't say anything immediately. He came and stood beside her and looked at the grain. She waited for the sentence. "You should have consulted me. You moved too quickly. This is exactly what happens." "You made a mistake," he said. "I know, good." He looked at the ruined grain with an expression that was not, she realized, contempt. "Then you are finally behaving like the rest of us." She looked at him. "That's not particularly comforting." It wasn't meant to be comforting. It was meant to be accurate. He turned to face her. People who actually do the work eventually get something wrong. The ones who never make mistakes are the ones who never make decisions. He paused. Crowther's accounts have been perfectly balanced for 25 years. The implication landed exactly where he intended it. Rose looked at him. You've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about a great many things. He held the door open. Come inside. It's 11 degrees and you've been standing here long enough. She went inside. She didn't apologize for the grain. He hadn't asked her to. They sat in the estate office, with the account books spread between them. And he explained, methodically and without condescension, what he knew about winter transport routes in the North Riding that she had not yet had the opportunity to learn. She listened. She asked questions. He answered them. At some point she couldn't have said exactly when it stopped being a lesson and became a conversation. They worked until nearly midnight. When she finally looked up from the ledgers, her neck aching, she found him watching her with an expression she still didn't have a name for. You're not what I expected, she said, nor are you. She almost asked what he had expected. She stopped herself. She was not sure she was ready for the answer. She gathered the documents. She said good night. She went upstairs. And she thought, in the particular way she turned things over when she was alone, about what it meant that he had come to find her in the grain store. Not to lecture, not to correct, simply to stand beside her. In the cold, while she faced the consequence of her mistake. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She filed it. Carefully, February brought Beatrice Vale. Rose had known she was coming. Nathaniel had mentioned it with characteristic economy. Beatrice Vale will be visiting the Hartwell property next month. She has indicated she may call at Blackmere. Rose had received this information with characteristic composure and then gone very still inside herself for approximately 45 seconds. Beatrice Vale arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with a small personal staff, excellent luggage, and a face so composed and symmetrical that looking at it felt almost like looking at a painting of a person rather than the person themselves. She was beautiful. Rose had known she would be. She had spent 2 weeks trying to prepare herself for how beautiful. And she had not quite succeeded. They took tea in the drawing room, just the three of them, which Rose suspected was not an accident. Beatrice was socially too skilled for accidents. I was not certain what to expect, Beatrice said, with a warmth that was genuine enough to be convincing and careful enough to be a warning. You are not what I imagined. What did you imagine? Rose asked. A brief pause, the kind that contains a decision about honesty. Someone more, Beatrice considered the word, overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed fairly often, Rose said pleasantly. I simply don't find it useful to show it. Something moved in Beatrice's eyes. Not hostility. Something more interesting than hostility. Assessment. The north wing repairs, Beatrice said. Smoothly, as if pivoting. I heard they've been authorized. Nathaniel mentioned some years ago that the cost was considerable, Rose agreed. We negotiated the contract at the start of January. Local craftsmen rather than London contractors, it will take longer. But the quality is better and the money stays in the county. Nathaniel said nothing. He was watching his tea. A sensible approach, Beatrice said. Thank you. The warmth was still there. The assessment was still there. Underneath both of them, carefully contained, was something Rose could identify precisely because she had spent her life in institutions where everything felt like this. A structure designed to appear hospitable that was fundamentally a test. After Beatrice left, Nathaniel and Rose sat in the drawing room in silence for a moment. She was trying to find out if I know what I'm doing, Rose said. Yes, do you think she decided? Nathaniel considered. She's Beatrice Vale. She decided about 6 minutes in and spent the rest of the visit confirming it. He picked up his tea. She thinks you know what you're doing. How can you tell? She stopped asking questions designed to trip you, and started asking questions she actually wanted the answers to. Rose thought about that. She's not as simple as she seems. Nobody here is. He set his cup down. Including the people who wish you weren't here. It was one of the most direct things he had ever said to her. She wasn't sure if it was a warning or a declaration. She thought it might be both. March brought a discovery that changed everything. Rose had been working through the estate's agricultural contracts, the older ones. The ones from before Nathaniel's tenure, cross-referencing them with land registry documents she had requested from the county office. It was painstaking work. It was also not her area. She knew numbers. Nathaniel knew land. She'd started bringing him the anomalies, the entries that didn't quite resolve, and he would tell her what they meant in context. It had become their working method. On a Tuesday evening in early March, she brought him a contract from 12 years ago, a land drainage agreement covering 40 acres of tenant farmland on the estate's eastern boundary. The contractor named in the agreement was a firm she had seen listed in Crowther's accounts under several different headings over the past decade. Nathaniel read the contract. He went very quiet. "What does it mean?" Rose asked. "This land was drained," he said. "I've seen the drainage myself." The work was completed. He turned the page. "But the firm listed here, I've never heard of it." He looked up. "And the signature on the approval." Rose waited. "That's my father's signature," Nathaniel said. "But my father died the year before this contract was dated. The silence between them was different from all the previous silences." Rose said carefully, "The date is notarized." She sat down. They looked at the document together. "Crowther managed the notarization process," Nathaniel said. "Yes." "Crowther also managed the contractor payments." "Yes." Nathaniel set the document on the desk. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling in the particular way he looked at things when he was arriving somewhere he had not wanted to go. "How much?" he said. "I don't know yet," Rose said. "I've found this one instance clearly. There may be more." "There very likely are more." She paused. "I want to bring in an outside auditor. Someone with no connection to Blackmere or to Crowther. That will alert him." "Yes." "It will. He'll have time now." She looked at him directly. "I think he already knows we're looking. I think he's known since January. And I think that what he does next, now that he knows, is more important than what the auditor finds." A pause. "A man who has hidden something for 12 years does not simply wait to be caught." Nathaniel looked at her. "What does he do?" he said. "He moves first," Rose said quietly. "He finds a way to make the accusation land somewhere else before it lands on him." The fire popped in the grate. They both heard it. "We need to be careful," Nathaniel said. "Yes, and we need to be faster than he is." "Yes." He stood. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for a moment. And she waited, because she had learned, was still learning, that Nathaniel Ashbourne processed difficult things with his back to the room. And interrupting that process was not useful. "I owe you an acknowledgement," he said. Without turning. "I defended him in January. When you first raised concerns." He turned. "I told you that suspicion based on 4 days of observation was insufficient grounds. You were right to be cautious. I was wrong to be defensive." He said it simply. Without drama. The way he said most difficult things, as if difficulty were not a reason to avoid accuracy. "You were looking at the numbers. I was protecting a relationship." "Those are not the same thing." Rose looked at him. In the charitable institution, when something went wrong, when a supervisor was finally held accountable, when a long-standing problem was finally named, the people who'd had to watch and wait and wonder always experienced a specific feeling. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Something quieter and harder than either of those. The particular grief of being right about something you had hoped desperately to be wrong about. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet." He moved back toward the desk. "We still have to prove it." She pulled the file toward her. "Then we'd better start." They worked until 2 in the morning. At some point, without either of them quite deciding it had happened, they had stopped being a duke and a practical arrangement and become two people bent over the same documents at the same desk, following the same thread through the same dark, with the same stakes on the line. Rose didn't notice the moment it changed. She only noticed when she finally looked up and found him asleep in the chair across the desk, that she wasn't afraid of Blackmere anymore. She pulled a blanket from the chest near the wall, the one the junior clerks used on late nights, which she knew about, because she knew about everything in this house now, and she put it over him without waking him. She looked at his face for a moment, quiet, tired. A man who had inherited a house full of secrets and spent years not knowing it, and who was now because of her knowing. She went to bed. She lay in the dark. She thought about the forged signature, and Crowther's 25 years of perfect balance, and the 4 remaining letters in her desk drawer. And the way Nathaniel had said, we need to be faster than he is the we. So unremarkable, so automatic, as if it had always been the correct pronoun. Outside, Blackmere Hall breathed in the March dark. 200 years of stone and debt and history, and the compressed weight of generations. And somewhere in the estate office, a man slept in a chair with her blanket over him. Both of them having just agreed, without quite saying so, that whatever came next, they would face it from the same side. Octavia's letter arrived the following morning. Rose read it before breakfast. It was brief, precisely written, and carried the particular quality of a document designed to appear reasonable while containing something that was not. The family intends to gather at Blackmere for Christmas. We expect to arrive on the 20th of December. Please make the necessary arrangements. Not a request. Not an inquiry, an announcement. Rose set the letter on the table beside the teapot. Nathaniel came in, saw her face, and picked up the letter without asking. He read it, he set it down. Christmas, he said. The 20th, Rose confirmed. He looked at her. My mother does not make social calls. I know, this an inspection, Rose said. I know that too. She poured her tea, her hands were entirely steady. How many will come, Julian? Lydia, Beatrice Vale will likely be included. Several family acquaintances whose opinions my mother considers influential. He paused. 8 or 9 guests, minimum. Preparations will need to begin in April to have the house ready properly. December. The north wing repairs will need to be finished by November at the latest. The kitchen will need additional staff for the Christmas period. We will want to review the linen inventory, the wine cellar, and the guest room furnishings, Rose. He waited until she stopped. Are you all right? She looked at him. She thought about 23 people and an empty chair. She thought about he cannot put generations into your blood. She thought about Julian's voice saying, the orphan duchess thinks running a dukedom is like counting potatoes, and all the people who had laughed. She thought about 8 months of work, and Mrs. Pennington's folded paper, and the forged signature on a 12-year-old drainage contract. I will be, she said. She picked up her tea, she drank it. We have 9 months, she said. That's enough time. She believed it. She had to believe it. Because if Octavia Ashbourne arrived at Blackmere in December and found what she expected to find, chaos, inadequacy, a foundling wife in over her head, she would not need to say a single cruel word. She would simply look, and that look would be enough. Rose was not going to give her that look. She set her cup down. She stood up. She went to find Mrs. Pennington. The 20th of December arrived the way bad things often do, quietly, and slightly ahead of schedule. Octavia's carriage pulled through the Blackmere gates at 2:30 in the afternoon, which was 45 minutes earlier than the time stated in her final correspondence. Rose noticed this immediately, because she noticed everything, and because she had learned, in the 9 months since that letter arrived at the breakfast table, that Octavia Ashbourne did nothing without intention. She had come early to catch the house unprepared. She had not succeeded. Rose was standing in the entrance hall when the carriage door opened. She was dressed in deep blue wool, not the most fashionable color, not the most expensive fabric, but well cut and immaculate. Mrs. Pennington was behind her to the left. The senior footman was positioned correctly. The hall was warm, the floors were clean, every candle was lit. Octavia stepped inside and stopped. She looked at the hall. She looked at Rose. She looked at the hall again. You're early, Rose said pleasantly. We expected you at 3. Your room is quite ready. though Mrs. Pennington will take you up whenever you'd like to rest before dinner." Octavia said nothing for a moment. Her eyes moved through the hall with the systematic efficiency of a woman who had been inspecting houses since before Rose was born. Looking for the crack in the plaster, the candlestick slightly tilted. The footman whose collar wasn't quite straight, she found nothing. "The north wing," she said finally. "I understand there were repairs. Completed in November," Rose said. "You've been given rooms there. The plasterwork is new. I think you'll find it rather better than the original." Octavia looked at her with an expression that was not quite respect, and not quite its opposite. It occupied the narrow, dangerous territory between them. "Julian and Lydia are behind us," she said. "Beatrice Vale will arrive tomorrow." "I know." "Their rooms are ready as well." Another silence. Then Octavia moved forward into the house, and Mrs. Pennington stepped up to guide her. And Rose stood in the entrance hall for exactly 3 more seconds before allowing herself one quiet breath. 9 months. Every decision, every repair, every supplier negotiation, every conversation with Mrs. Pennington at 7 in the morning over cold tea and household ledgers, all of it had pointed toward this moment. The moment when Octavia Ashbourne walked into Blackmere Hall and found nothing to condemn. It was only the first hour. Rose knew better than to count it as a victory. Julian arrived 20 minutes after his mother, which told Rose he had deliberately let Octavia arrive first. Which told her he had wanted someone else to absorb the initial impact of whatever reaction the house produced. He came in with the particular energy of a man who had been rehearsing something unpleasant and was now looking for the correct moment to deploy it. He looked around the hall. He looked at Rose. "You've redecorated," he said. "We've repaired," Rose said. "There's a difference. The distinction seems to have cost a considerable sum, less than allowing the north wing roof to continue failing would have cost." She met his eyes steadily. "By my calculation, approximately £400 less over the next 5 years." Julian smiled. It was a beautiful smile. He had a beautiful face and no scruples about using it as a weapon. "Always calculating, aren't you? When it's useful," Rose said. "Will you need anything before dinner, Lord Julian?" "Your valet arrived ahead of you. Your room is prepared." She didn't give him time to respond. She turned to speak with the footman about the luggage. She felt Julian's eyes on her back for a long moment. Then she heard him move toward the stairs. She released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Lydia came in last, alone, without announcement, carrying a small traveling bag herself rather than waiting for a footman. She stopped when she saw Rose, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, the woman who had laughed at a dinner table 11 months ago. And the woman who had been laughed at. Lydia had changed since January. Rose had seen her twice since the wedding, both times briefly. Both times in circumstances where Octavia was present, and Lydia performed her role accordingly. But something had shifted in her face. Some of the hardness had gone. Or rather, the hardness was still there. It was Lydia's fundamental material, but it had changed shape, pointing inward now rather than outward. "The house looks well," Lydia said. It cost her something. Rose could see it cost her something. "Thank you," Rose said simply. Lydia looked at her for another moment. "Then I didn't know you'd seen my mother's letter." "The one about the marriage arrangement." Rose went still. "The widower," Lydia said quietly. "Lord Ashford, 51 years old." She said it the way someone says a number they have memorized against their will. She put it in a letter to Julian. Julian left it in the sitting room at the London house 3 weeks ago. "I read it." A pause. "She wants it settled before spring." The hall was empty now except for the two of them. "I see," Rose said carefully. "You don't need to say anything." Lydia's voice was precise. Controlled. The voice of a woman who has decided that composure is preferable to any alternative. "I simply wanted you to know that I know. Whatever happens this week, I wanted you to know." She picked up her traveling bag. She went upstairs. Rose stood in the hall for a moment after she'd gone. She thought about what Lydia had just done, not asked for help. Not complained, not performed distress, simply stated a fact and trusted Rose to understand what she was being told. It was, Rose thought, the most honest thing anyone in this family had said to her in 11 months. She filed it, and then she went to find Nathaniel. The first 2 days passed in a controlled performance of civilized hospitality that required approximately twice the energy of anything Rose had yet done at Blackmere. Every meal was correct. Every conversation was managed. The house functioned with the smooth precision of a mechanism that had been carefully assembled and was now being carefully operated. And Rose was the mechanism's engineer, which meant she was also its most exposed component. Octavia watched everything. She watched the servants. She watched the food. She watched how Rose spoke to guests. How she moved through a room, whether she used the right title, when addressing the visiting baronet who arrived on the 21st. She watched with the patient thoroughness of a woman who had been waiting 11 months for a single significant mistake. She didn't find one. This seemed to produce in Octavia not satisfaction, but a focused intensification, as if the absence of obvious failure made her look harder for the subtle kind. Julian found a different approach. He was charming at dinner. Brilliantly charming, the kind of charm that fills a room and makes everyone in it feel included while simultaneously serving a purpose only the charmer fully understands. He told stories. He asked questions. He steered conversations with the light, practiced hand of someone who had spent his entire adult life using social situations the way Rose used ledgers, as instruments for locating information. By the third evening, he had drawn out, from 3 different guests, their opinions on estate management, orphan-born wives, the declining standards of aristocratic marriage, and the particular tragedy of ancient houses falling into the wrong hands. He never said any of these things himself. He just listened, and laughed at the right moments and refilled people's glasses. Rose watched him do it and thought, this is what you do when you can't attack the evidence directly. You build the atmosphere in which the evidence won't matter. She filed that too. On the evening of the 23rd, she was passing the library corridor when she heard Nathaniel's voice and stopped. Not because she intended to listen, because the other voice was Octavia's. And the door was not fully closed, and what she heard made her stop involuntarily. The way you stop when something cold touches the back of your neck. You married her because she was useful, Octavia was saying. The words were quiet and precise. That was the transaction. Competent household management in exchange for security. It was practical. I understand practical. A pause. I'm not asking you to have chosen differently, Octavia's voice again. I'm asking you to be honest with yourself about what you chose. Nathaniel said something Rose couldn't quite hear. She did not wait for the rest. She walked away from the door and down the corridor and into the small sitting room at the end of it, where she stood alone in the dark for a long moment. You married her because she was useful. She had known this. She had always known this. She had accepted the arrangement with her eyes open because she understood practical arrangements and believed they were safer than anything that involved wanting. But knowing a thing is not the same as hearing it's loud by someone else in a tone that carries no cruelty and therefore cannot be dismissed as cruelty. She stood in the dark and felt the wound she had always carried. Usefulness is the only reason anyone keeps you open, fresh and clean as a new cut. She stood there for 3 minutes. Then she smoothed her dress, squared her shoulders, and went back to her guests. Whatever Nathaniel had replied to his mother, she did not ask him. Not that night. The 24th arrived with the particular electricity of a day that has been building toward something. Beatrice Vale had been at Blackmere for 3 days. She had been, on the surface, entirely pleasant, careful, perceptive, and less hostile than Rose had anticipated. There had been moments over meals and afternoon visits where Rose had caught Beatrice watching her with the same careful assessment she had seen at their first meeting in January. But the assessment had changed quality. It was still measuring. What it was measuring for had shifted, Rose noticed. She wasn't certain what to do with it. What happened in the morning? however, had nothing to do with Beatrice. Rose found Lydia in the east corridor at 9:30, standing outside the door of the small writing room, with her hands pressed flat against the wall, as if she needed something solid to hold on to. Her face was the face of someone who has just received news that has momentarily removed their ability to arrange their expression. Lydia. Rose touched her arm. Lydia turned. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them dry was visible. She told him yes, Lydia said this morning. She wrote to Lord Ashford this morning and told him yes. I saw the letter on the tray. Rose looked at her. Did she tell you? She told me last night that it was a sensible arrangement and that I would grow comfortable with time. Lydia made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Grow comfortable, as though I were a new pair of shoes. Rose said nothing immediately. She was thinking. She was thinking about what she had walked away from doing 11 months ago when she had stood in a London dining room and understood completely that she was not wanted and had chosen to stay anyway. She was thinking about the calculation she had made: usefulness, security, a practical arrangement, and whether that calculation had been courage or simply a different kind of fear. She was thinking about what it meant to have a choice and what it meant not to have one. Come with me, Rose said. Lydia followed her, and Rose did something she had not done before in this house. She walked directly into Octavia's private sitting room without knocking. Octavia was at her writing desk. She looked up with the expression of a woman who had not been interrupted without her permission in approximately 40 years. Rose. Lydia began behind her. I would like to speak with you about Lydia's engagement, Rose said. Octavia set down her pen. Her face arranged itself into a careful neutrality. This is a family matter. I am family, Rose said quietly. You may not believe that yet, but a silence. Lydia is 24 years old, Rose continued. Lord Ashford is 51. I understand the financial reasoning. I can read the estate accounts well enough to understand exactly how useful his resources would be to the family. She paused. I can also read Lydia's face well enough to understand what being useful to the family will cost her. Octavia's voice was very controlled. You are overstepping, perhaps. Rose looked at her directly. But you once told me I could not put generations into my blood. You were right. I cannot. Another pause. What I can do is tell you that I have spent my entire life watching institutions make practical arrangements with people who had no power to refuse them. And I know exactly what those people look like 20 years later. She did not look away. I will not watch you make one with your daughter. The room was completely silent. Lydia, behind Rose, had gone very still. Octavia looked at Rose for a long moment. Her expression had moved through its careful neutrality into something harder to name, something that was not quite anger and not quite shock and contained. Beneath both, something older and more private. You presume, she said at last, to teach me about my own daughter. I presume to tell you what I see, Rose said. What you do with it is your choice. She turned and left. Lydia followed her into the corridor. They walked for a moment without speaking. That was either very brave or very foolish, Lydia said. Probably both, Rose admitted. She'll be furious. Yes, she may make the Christmas gathering impossible. She was already planning to. Rose kept walking. At least now she'll be furious for a reason that has nothing to do with my parentage. Lydia made the sound again, the one that was not quite a laugh. This time it got further before it stopped. It was the closest thing to warmth they had yet managed. It was enough. The dinner on the evening of the 24th was the largest of the visit 14 at table, including the neighboring baronet and his wife, a family solicitor Octavia had specifically invited, and Silas Crowther. Rose had not expected Crowther to be included. She saw him arrive, and something went cold and quiet in the center of her chest. The way things go cold and quiet when a pattern you have been tracking suddenly resolves into a shape you recognize. He hadn't been invited to Christmas dinner at Blackmere in previous years. She knew this because she had reviewed 12 years of household guest records. He came on Thursdays for accounts. He attended the annual estate review. He was not a social guest. Octavia had invited him. Rose looked at Nathaniel across the table. She looked long enough that he turned from his conversation and met her eyes. She moved her gaze to Crowther. She moved it back. Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but she saw something shift behind it. He understood. She watched Crowther throughout dinner. He was perfectly composed, more composed than any of the legitimate guests, which she noted as a man who had prepared for this evening very carefully. He ate without apparent appetite. He drank moderately. He spoke when spoken to and volunteered nothing. He looked at her twice. Both times he looked away before she looked away. That was the tell. A man with nothing to hide doesn't look away first. A man who is calculating when to move looks away because he doesn't want you to see him counting. She counted instead. The dinner ended. The party moved to the drawing room. It was Julian who did it. She hadn't expected it to be Julian. She had expected Crowther to choose his own moment, his own instrument. She had underestimated the arrangement between them. She would not make that mistake again, but she didn't have the opportunity to make it again. Because Julian was already standing, and the room had gone quiet the way rooms do when someone stands in the middle of a social occasion with a piece of paper in their hand and an expression of careful, performed reluctance. "I apologize for interrupting," Julian said. He was magnificent at this, the performance of the reluctant messenger. The man compelled by conscience against his personal inclination. "I have been debating whether to raise this privately or before witnesses." "I have decided that witnesses are necessary," Nathaniel said. Very quietly, Julian set the paper on the table. "These are transfer authorizations," he said, "from the estate account to a private account held by a firm that does not appear to exist. The authorizations are dated over the past 3 months. He looked around the table. They bear the Duchess's signature. The room went completely silent. Rose looked at the papers. She looked at her signature. It was her signature. She could see from 6 feet away that it was her handwriting, the exact particular slant of her R. The way she crossed her T, the compressed precision of a woman who had learned to write in a charitable institution's accounts office, where paper was a careful resource. It was perfect. It was not hers. "Several £1,000s, Julian said. Into the silence, missing from the estate account. "And the paper trail leads here." He paused. The reluctance in his performance was exquisite. "I take no pleasure in this." Crowther said nothing. He sat with his hands folded and his face arranged in an expression of troubled concern. Rose understood, in that exact moment, the full architecture of what had been built. Not just the forged documents, those were the evidence. The real construction was the context, 11 months of Julian's whisper campaign. The London jokes, the social atmosphere he had been quietly assembling since January. The orphan duchess, the foundling who thinks running a dukedom is counting potatoes. Every laughed-at mistake, every aristocratic eyebrow raised. Every conversation steered toward the question of whether someone like her could really be trusted with something like this. The documents didn't need to be convincing on their own. They needed to be convincing in the context of what everyone already half believed. She looked at the room. The solicitor's face was very careful. The baronet's wife had pressed her fingers to her lips. Beatrice Vale was looking at the papers with an expression Rose could not yet read. Octavia's face was complicated, not satisfied. Something more ambivalent than either, as if she had not known this was coming and was not certain how to feel that it had. Lydia was looking at Julian. Nathaniel stood up, he said. "I would like everyone except family to leave the room." His voice was exactly as it always was, level. Unhurried, carrying the assumption of compliance. The guests moved toward the door with the careful speed of people removing themselves from something that is not their disaster. The solicitor hesitated. Nathaniel looked at him once. He left. Crowther was the last to move. He moved slowly and with dignity. The way a man moves when he has done what he came to do and is content to wait outside for the outcome. The door closed. Nathaniel stood. Rose sat. Explain, Nathaniel said to Julian. The documents explain themselves. The documents explain someone's forgery. Nathaniel's voice had not risen. It was the quality of his stillness that was frightening, the stillness of a man exerting considerable effort to remain contained. Where did you get them? They were brought to my attention by Crowther. Julian paused. A fraction of a second. The fraction of a second that contains the moment someone realizes their performance has been seen through. The documents are what they are, Julian said. The source doesn't change. The source changes everything, Nathaniel said. Rose reached forward and picked up the documents. She held them under the candle. She was not trembling. She was aware that she was not trembling. And she was aware that not trembling was requiring something from her. But she was managing it. She looked at the signature. She turned the page over. She held the bottom of the second page closer to the candlelight. There it was. It was small. If she hadn't been looking for something, if she hadn't been. For 9 months, looking for exactly this kind of something, she would have missed it. The wax seal on the corner of the second document. Pale red. Distinctive color. A very particular blue-tinted shade that she had seen before. On a desk in an office used with a very particular spirit lamp. Crowther's London office, not Blackmere. She set the documents down. I can't explain the signature, she said. Her voice was steady. I didn't write it, but I can't prove that in this room tonight. She looked at Nathaniel. What I can tell you, she said, is that these documents were sealed in London. Not at Blackmere. The wax compound is different. And the account described in the transfer authorization, I want to see the full account number. Julian frowned. What difference does the account number, Rose said again. To Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at the document. His face changed. It changed the way faces change when something snaps into place. When a piece of information you have had for months suddenly connects to a piece of information you received this morning. This account, he said slowly, corresponds to the account listed in the land drainage contract. He looked up. The one dated after my father died. The silence this time was different in quality from all previous silences. It was the silence of a room where the architectures of something has just been revealed, not just the documents on the table, but the 12 years of careful construction underneath them. Julian looked between them, for the first time that evening. His composure showed a crack. He started. Did you know? Nathaniel said quietly. Julian said nothing. Julian. Nathaniel's voice had gone somewhere very quiet and very hard. Did you know about the drainage contract? The silence that followed was its own answer. Rose looked at Julian's face and understood. He hadn't known all of it. He had known enough. Crowther had given him enough payments. Formation, the comfortable arrangement of a man who had been subsidizing Julian's London lifestyle in exchange for willful blindness, and Julian had taken what was offered without looking at the larger picture. He hadn't built the fraud. He had simply benefited from it. And looked the other way, and then, when the structure began to collapse, had agreed to let it collapse on someone else. I didn't. Julian started. Stopped. His voice, for the first time since Rose had known him, sounded young, genuinely young, stripped of its performance. I didn't know it went back that far. But you knew something, Rose said. He didn't answer. That was enough, Nathaniel said. Get Crowther. The footman was sent. 2 minutes passed. The footman returned. Crowther was not in the corridor. Crowther's coat was gone from the entrance hall. Crowther had left Blackmere sometime in the previous 30 minutes. Nathaniel's expression, when he received this information, was the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he had suspected and hoped to be wrong about. He looked at Rose, the blue spirit lamp, he said. His London office, she confirmed. He sealed the documents there. Which means he prepared them in advance before tonight. Before Christmas, before he was certain exactly when he would use them. She paused. He's been holding them for some time, waiting for the right moment. The right moment being, when I was close enough to the truth that waiting any longer became more dangerous than moving. The room was very quiet. Lydia, who had not spoken since the guests left, said, "I saw him, Julian." Her voice was flat and certain. "I saw you coming out of Crowther's office in October." "In London. You thought I was upstairs." Julian looked at his sister. Lydia, "I didn't understand it then," she said. "I thought it was ordinary estate business." She looked at the documents on the table. It wasn't ordinary estate business. Julian's face had finished its journey to somewhere uncomfortable and stayed there. Beatrice Vale, who had also remained, Rose had not noticed. Had not thought to notice, but she was there, quiet in the corner of the room, said, "The creditor." She said it quietly, almost to herself. And then louder, "The creditor Crowther used to manage your father's loans." "Nathaniel. The firm Harwick and Souls. I know that name." She looked up. "My father had dealings with them 6 years ago. They dissolved 2 years after. But before they dissolved, they transferred their account holdings to a successor firm." She paused. "The account number." Rose looked at the document. She looked at Beatrice. Something moved in her chest that was not entirely what she would have expected to feel toward Beatrice Vale. "You have the documentation?" Rose asked. "My father keeps meticulous records," Beatrice said. "I can write to him tonight." A small silence. "Thank you," Rose said. Beatrice held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and looked away. Nathaniel said to the footman, "Send men to the Thornwick Road and to the coaching inn at the crossroads." He paused. "And send for the county magistrate." The footman went. The fire crackled in the empty room. Julian sat down heavily in his chair. He pressed both hands over his face, and for a long moment he was just a man sitting in his family's drawing room with his hands over his face. And Rose thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who looks away from the wrong thing for long enough that you become complicit in it. She thought about all the comfortable silences, all the gracefully accepted money, all the jokes about orphan duchesses that had been so much easier to make when she seemed like the threat in the room. She thought about the fact that he had not built this. He had simply let it be built around him. That was its own kind of choosing. "Julian," she said. He lowered his hands. "Tell us what you know," she said. "All of it, tonight." He looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him, something stripped and raw and ashamed, beneath which was something she had not expected: relief. The particular relief of someone who has been carrying the weight of a convenient silence and has finally, terrifyingly, run out of road. He started talking. The clock on the mantel read 11:15 when he finished. Outside on the Thornwick Road, they later learned, 2 of Nathaniel's men caught Crowther's hired carriage at the crossroads. He had been in the coachman's box rather than inside a smaller man's attempt to be less recognizable. He was brought back to Blackmere just before midnight. When they brought him in, through the servants' entrance, Rose was in the estate office with Nathaniel, Julian's full account written out in her handwriting and signed by all 3 of them. The external auditor had been sent for 3 hours earlier, a man in York whose reputation Nathaniel had confirmed in October. Quietly, without telling Crowther. Crowther looked at the assembled documentation on the desk. He looked at Rose. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had made one serious miscalculation and was now performing the arithmetic of where exactly it had gone wrong. She thought, the candles. He never expected me to start with the candles. He had spent 25 years making himself so indispensable, so trusted, so thoroughly part of the institution that no one would look at the small things. No one looks at candle expenditure. No one questions the supplier they've used for 15 years. No one audits the man who does the auditing. No one. Until a foundling with work-worn hands and nothing to lose and everything to prove arrives at a house she has no business being in and starts reading from the outside in. He said nothing. She said nothing either. Nathaniel spoke instead, with the quiet finality of a man reading a verdict he has arrived at carefully and does not intend to revisit. When it was over, the statements taken, the magistrate satisfied. The immediate matter settled, Nathaniel sent everyone from the room except Rose. They sat in the estate office in the deep quiet of past midnight. The fire had burned low. The candles, 340 of them somewhere in this house, purchased and recorded and cross-referenced and noticed, cast a warm, uneven light across the ledgers and letters and signed statements that covered the desk between them. Nathaniel looked at her. "I owe you don't," she said. "Rose, you stood beside me when they put those documents on the table," she said. "You stood beside me before you knew about the wax seal." Before Beatrice spoke, before Julian talked, she held his gaze. "You pushed the ring back." He was quiet. "That's what I needed," she said. "That's enough." He looked at her for a long moment. "It isn't," he said. "But we'll discuss the rest when I've slept." She almost smiled. She was too tired to smile. She was also, she realized, somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the cold clarity of what the evening had required from her. Something she hadn't expected to be. Not victorious. Not vindicated. She was safe, for the first time in this house, in a way that had nothing to do with contracts or practical arrangements or the security of a title. She felt safe. She didn't know yet what to do with that. She gathered the documents. She stood, and somewhere in the house above them, the clock began to strike midnight. And Christmas came to Blackmere Hall, and for the first time since Rose Mercer had arrived in this family's drawing room and been given an empty chair, not a single person in it was laughing. Christmas morning arrived gray and cold, the way mornings do after nights that have taken everything out of a house and left it standing but emptied. Rose was up before anyone else. She had slept 4 hours, enough to function. Not enough to feel rested, and she was in the estate office by 6. Reviewing the documents they had assembled the night before. Checking the sequence of evidence against Julian's account. Making certain that what they had was what they needed, and that nothing had been missed in the exhaustion of midnight. She was not, she told herself, avoiding the rest of the house. She was working. These were sometimes the same thing. Mrs. Pennington found her at 7:30 with tea, and the particular expression of a woman who has heard more than she was meant to and has made her peace with it. "The guests are asking about breakfast," the housekeeper said. "The baronet's wife wants to know if the schedule has changed." "The schedule hasn't changed," Rose said. "Breakfast at 9. Tell them whatever you think is appropriate about last night, Mrs." Pennington set the tea down. "What I think is appropriate," she said carefully, "is nothing whatsoever." "That's probably a pause." The housekeeper didn't leave immediately. "He came down at 5, she said. "His Grace sat in the kitchen for 20 minutes. Drank tea with cup. He does it sometimes, Mrs." Pennington said quietly, "When something is weighing on him." "Has done since he was a boy." She paused. "Cook says he asked after you." Rose held her cup. "Thank you, Mrs. Pennington," she said. The housekeeper left. Rose sat with the information for a moment, turning it over carefully. The way she turned over things, she wasn't yet certain what to do with. Nathaniel Ashbourne, Duke of Blackmere, sitting in his own kitchen at 5 in the morning, drinking tea with his cook. Asking after his wife. She filed it. She went back to the documents. Julian came to find her at 8. He knocked, which surprised her. He was not a man who usually knocked. He stood in the doorway of the estate office, looking like someone who had also slept 4 hours, which was probably true, and whose face had been reorganized overnight into something considerably less polished than its usual arrangement. "May I come in?" he asked. She gestured to the chair across the desk. He sat. He folded his hands in his lap the way people do when they are trying to look composed and are not succeeding entirely. He was 21 months younger than Nathaniel, and this morning he looked at the age visible beneath the charm the way the structure of a house is visible when you've taken the wallpaper down. "I want to say something," he said. "All right. I'm aware that an apology from me carries." He stopped. Started again. "I'm aware that the words mean considerably less than they might. Given everything." He looked at the desk rather than at her. I knew something was wrong. With the accounts. With a pause. I didn't know the extent of it. I want to be accurate about that. I didn't know about my father's signature. I didn't know how far back it went, but I knew there were irregularities. And I took money that I understood on some level was not properly sourced. Rose said nothing, and then when it began to come apart, Julian continued. I agreed to let it come apart on you, because he stopped again. The stop was longer this time, because it was easier. Because you were already the person everyone was prepared to believe was the problem. The fire popped. I know, Rose said. That's all I had to say. He looked at her then. Directly, for the first time since he'd sat down. You're not going to tell me it's forgiven. I'm going to tell you it's heard, Rose said. Forgiveness is a different process. It takes longer than one morning. She met his eyes steadily. But I believe you mean it. That's somewhere to start from. Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with something that was almost his old lightness but carried new weight, Nathaniel said you'd say something like that, did he? He said you're uncommonly precise about the difference between what you feel and what you're prepared to say. A small pause. He meant it as a compliment. Rose thought about that for a moment. What happens to you now? She asked. Julian's expression settled into something sober and deliberate. Nathaniel and I spoke this morning. Early. Before the house was up. He looked at his hands. My debts are settled, the legitimate ones, and the ones that were legitimate in appearance only. In exchange, I relinquished the discretionary income arrangement my father left me. For 3 years minimum. He paused, and I leave London. Where? There's an Ashbourne property in Derbyshire. Smaller, agricultural. Nathaniel needs someone to oversee the tenant management, while the primary steward recovers from illness. He said it with the careful flatness of a man practicing, saying a thing that is difficult without making it sound difficult. It is not what I would have chosen. No, Rose agreed. But it is what I chose, in a way. He stood. He paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said. Not turning around, the first time I saw you kneel down to help that footman, I genuinely thought that Nathaniel had made the most absurd mistake of his life. He was quiet for a moment. I was wrong about quite a lot of things. He left. Rose sat alone for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the evidence summary. Because the magistrate was returning at 10, and the documents needed to be in proper order. And feelings, even significant ones, had always kept better when she gave them somewhere specific to wait. The formal proceedings with the magistrate took 2 hours. Silas Crowther, who had been held overnight at the county constable's office, was brought to give his account. He had, in the intervening hours, assembled a version of events that was carefully constructed, admitting to certain irregularities, attributing others to administrative confusion, and maintaining throughout the composed pleasantness that had served him for 25 years. It did not serve him this time. Rose had assembled the evidence in sequence. The candle accounts, the timber invoices, the forged drainage contract, the dissolved creditor firm, Beatrice Vale's father's records which had arrived by express messenger that morning. An efficiency that told Rose something significant about both Beatrice's relationship with her father and her father's record-keeping, and Julian's signed account. She laid it out for the magistrate without drama, without accusation, without a single word beyond what the documents themselves required. She had learned this from the accounts office at the charitable institution. If your numbers are right, you don't need to raise your voice. The numbers do the speaking. You simply have to arrange them so they can be heard. When she finished, the magistrate looked at the documents for a long time. He looked at Crowther. Crowther said nothing. It was the first time Rose had seen him with nothing to say. She felt no satisfaction in it. She had expected to feel some completion. Some closing of the wound that had been opened the night before when she had stood in a drawing room with her supposed signature on a forged document and felt the full weight of 23 months of accumulated contempt land in that one moment. She had expected resolution to feel like something. It felt, instead, like the moment after a very long climb when you finally stop moving. Not triumphant, tired, and aware suddenly of everything that still had to be walked back down. The magistrate spoke with Nathaniel privately for 30 minutes after the formal proceedings. When Nathaniel came out, his face had the particular settled quality it wore when something had been decided and he had moved past it into the practical considerations of what came next. He looked at Rose. "It's handled," he said. "Properly." She nodded. "The auditor arrives in January," he said. "The full scope of it will take some months to establish. But the immediate matter is resolved." He paused. "Crowther will not be returning to Blackmere." "No," she agreed. They stood in the corridor for a moment, the two of them, with the specific quiet between them that had become, over the past year, their particular kind of language. "Rose," he started. "Later," she said gently. "Whatever you want to say later." "After the guests have left." She looked at him. "We still have Christmas to get through." He almost smiled. "You're remarkable." "I'm practical," she said. "I've stopped believing those are different things." She went to supervise the breakfast. Octavia found her in the afternoon. The guests had been managed through Christmas dinner with the determined competence that Rose had been deploying since December 20th, and the house had reached the quiet hour when people retreat to their rooms, or their letters, or their own reflections. And the particular work of being a duchess consists of checking that everything is in order without anyone noticing the checking. Rose was in the small sitting room, reviewing the wine cellar inventory that tomorrow's dinner would require, when she heard Octavia's step in the corridor. She knew it by now, the measured pace, the small hesitation before entering a room, the way a woman moves when she has made a decision she is not entirely comfortable with but has made anyway. Octavia came in. She closed the door. She sat down across from Rose without being invited, which was, Rose thought, the most honest thing she had done since arriving at Blackmere. For a long moment neither of them spoke. "I did not know," Octavia said at last. "About what Julian had agreed to. About the documents." "I know you didn't," Rose said. Octavia looked at her sharply. "You know, you were surprised last night." "Not performing surprise, actually surprised." Rose set down the inventory. "You came here to find evidence of incompetence. You didn't come here to frame me for theft. Those are different projects." A silence. "You were looking for incompetence," Rose continued quietly. "Because if you found it, it would mean you were right. That pedigree predicts character. That where someone comes from determines what they're capable of." She paused. "It would have been tidier." Octavia's expression was unreadable in the particular way that things are unreadable when a great deal is happening beneath the surface. "Do you hate me?" she asked. The question was direct and completely uncharacteristic. It landed between them with the specific weight of something that had been held for a long time. "No," Rose said. Octavia seemed to have expected either yes or a diplomatic evasion. The simple no appeared to require adjustment. "Hatred would require me to arrange my life around you," Rose said. "I've had enough experience of people who weren't worth the arrangement." She held Octavia's gaze steadily. "What I am is tired, not of you specifically, of the particular work of proving every single day that I deserve to be in a room I was invited into." Octavia said nothing. "I understand why you doubted me," Rose continued. "I even understand why you're still doubting me, here. Now, after last night." She paused. "What I need you to understand is that your doubt no longer has the power to make me question myself. It took some months to get there, but I'm there." The fire crackled. Octavia looked at her hands for a moment. They were elegant hands, the hands of a woman who had never cracked them in cold water, never pressed them against grain sacks or coal scuttles or the rough edges of account books. Beautiful, preserved, and entirely without the information that hands get from work. "He told me something this morning," Octavia said. "Nathaniel." She didn't look up. "He told me that the first time he understood he had married you, not arranged a convenient partnership, but actually married you, was the night he sat beside you in the grain store." She paused. He said you didn't ask him to fix it. You didn't defend yourself. You simply sat with the consequence of a mistake you'd made and looked at what it was. Rose was quiet. He said he realized then that he had never in his adult life sat beside someone who responded to failure that way. Octavia finally looked up. Without performance, without either collapse or pretense. He sat beside me, Rose said. That was the thing he did, Yester said. He did. Another silence. This one different in quality, less armored. You challenged me about Lydia, Octavia said. I did. You overstepped. I know. You weren't wrong, Octavia said. The words cost her something. Rose could see the cost in the careful set of her mouth, the particular stillness of a proud woman making an admission she has decided deliberately to make. Octavia stopped. Reconsidered. The arrangement was financially appropriate. It was not. Lydia is not. She stopped again. Her hands moved slightly in her lap. A gesture so small Rose almost missed it. She is very like her father. Her father also preferred his own judgment to mine. And he was also frequently right. She's 24, Rose said gently. Yes, there's time. Octavia looked at her directly. I have not been kind to you. No, I'm not going to enumerate it. I imagine you've already enumerated it with considerably more precision than I'm capable of. Despite everything, despite the months of it, despite the empty chair and the jewels and the London whispers and all the small, precise cruelties, Rose felt something move in her chest that she recognized. After a moment, as unexpected compassion, not forgiveness. Compassion, the particular feeling that comes when you see clearly that a person has been wrong in a way they could not entirely help and are now at considerable personal cost trying to see it themselves. You may stay, Rose said, at Blackmere when you wish to visit. You are Nathaniel's mother and Lydia's mother, and that is not something I intend to remove from you. She paused. But Blackmere is mine to manage, and Lydia is her own to decide. And Nathaniel, she met Octavia's eyes steadily. Nathaniel is not available to be managed by anyone except himself. Octavia held her gaze. Those are your conditions, she said. Those are the facts, Rose said. Whether they feel like conditions is up to you. The silence stretched. Then Octavia stood. She smoothed her skirt with both hands, the gesture of a woman returning to herself after having briefly set herself down. She walked to the door. She paused. You said you would give him a future, she said. Without turning. On the night of the engagement dinner. I asked what you could possibly give him, and you said a future. I remember. You were not wrong about that either. A pause. Irritatingly, Rose sat alone for a moment. Then she pressed one hand flat against the inventory in her lap, felt the paper solid under her palm and breathed. Beatrice found her in the library that evening. The guests were down to their last night. The baronet were leaving in the morning. Julian had already arranged his departure for Derbyshire in 2 days, and Lydia had said, very quietly over dinner, that she was considering a visit to a school friend in Bath in January. Said it in the particular tone of a person testing whether they are permitted to have plans of their own. Rose had said, that sounds lovely. Nathaniel had agreed. Octavia had been silent for a moment, and then said the roads to Bath were better by spring, and Lydia should write ahead for rooms. It was not warmth, but it was something. Beatrice came into the library while Rose was adding a book to the return shelf, a household management text she had borrowed 3 weeks ago that she no longer needed because she had absorbed what it contained. I wanted to speak with you before I leave tomorrow, Beatrice said. Please sit, Rose said. Beatrice sat. She composed herself the way she always did, beautifully. Precisely, with the ease of long practice. And then she looked at Rose with an expression that had let go of something. I thought, Beatrice said carefully, that someone without aristocratic upbringing couldn't manage Blackmere. I know, Rose said. You said something similar in January. I meant it in January. Beatrice paused. I was wrong. Not entirely in the way I expected to be wrong, which I suppose is the nature of being wrong. She looked at the bookshelf rather than at Rose. I thought you would fail because you lacked refinement. You didn't fail, and I've been spending the past 2 days trying to work out which of my premises was incorrect. Which was it? Rose asked. I assumed refinement was the relevant skill, Beatrice said. It isn't, or it is, but it's not the primary one. She paused. The primary one is seeing clearly. Without out the particular film that comfort puts over things. Rose held the book she hadn't yet shelved. Comfort gave us fewer opportunities, Beatrice continued. To discover what we were made of. She said it with the specific quality of a person who has arrived at a thought honestly, rather than assembled it for presentation. That might be the kindest framing of it, Rose said. It's the truest one I have. Beatrice met her eyes. I don't know that we'll ever be close. Our situations are too different. And there's too much particular history. She paused. But I wanted you to know that I was wrong, and I know I was wrong. And you have my respect. Rose looked at her for a moment. You sent for those records, Rose said. Last night. You sent for your father's documentation the minute the documents appeared on that table. Before you knew whether I was innocent. Beatrice was quiet. Why? Rose asked, to pause. Because the wax seal was wrong, Beatrice said simply. I've seen Crowther's London seal before, at estate meetings my father attended. I recognized it on the second document. She paused. And because forging a duchess's signature to cover a 25-year fraud is a great deal of trouble to go to for a woman who is actually guilty. Rose almost smiled. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. Beatrice stood. I should have looked more carefully much earlier. She moved toward the door. You would have, she left. Rose stood alone in the library for a long moment. Then she shelved the book. She found Nathaniel in the estate office at 9:30. He was sitting at the desk with no documents in front of him, which was unusual enough that she stopped in the doorway. He looked up. He looked like a man who has been waiting for something and is not certain it's going to arrive. The guests are settled, she said. Yes, she came in. She sat across from him at the desk, where they had worked together for a year. Where they had rebuilt the accounts of this house piece by piece. Where they had sat until midnight, arguing about drainage contracts and supplier rates, and the particular stubbornness of a comptroller who smiled too warmly. She looked at him. You told your mother about the grain store, she said. You told her that was the moment you understood. He held her gaze. It was. She thought about what she had done when he said it. Filed it carefully in the place she kept things she didn't yet know what to do with. She had an entire archive of moments like that, small, specific, quietly definitive moments she had been collecting for a year and had not yet permitted herself to call what they were. I need to tell you something, she said. Something I should have said before now. All right, I heard part of what your mother said to you. The night of the 23rd. She kept her voice even. In the library corridor. I heard her say that you married me because I was useful. She paused. I didn't hear your response. Nathaniel was very still. I walked away before you answered, she said. And I told myself it didn't matter because I had always known the arrangement. But she stopped. She looked at the desk for a moment. And then back at him, because she had spent enough years not saying things to know the cost of continuing not to say them. I need to know what you said. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. I told her she was right, he said. Rose's expression didn't change. She had prepared for this, and then I told her she was also wrong, he continued. That she was right about what I believed when I proposed. And wrong about what is true now. What is true now? Rose asked quietly. He stood up. He came around the desk. He stood in front of her and looked at her with an expression she finally, after a year of filing, had a name for. I chose you because I trusted your judgment, he said. That was the beginning. That was what I told myself. He paused. Somewhere between the grain store and the midnight ledgers, and every argument we've had where you were right, and I took 3 days to admit it. It stopped being about judgment. She waited. You are not useful to me, Rose. She went very still. "You are necessary to me," he said. "There is a difference." The fire was the only sound in the room. She looked at him, this man who spoke like a contract and meant it like a confession, who had pulled out an empty chair and pushed back a ring and sat beside her in a cold grain store and asked after her at 5 in the morning in his own kitchen, and she felt something she had spent 48 months in this house very carefully not feeling, because she had believed, with a conviction that had only recently begun to loosen, that she was not entitled to it, that love, like everything else, had to be earned every morning. That usefulness was the price of staying. That rooms did not keep people who stopped being worth keeping. "I don't know how to do this," she said. Her voice was quiet and completely steady and entirely true. "I know how to manage accounts and handle suppliers and identify which footmen are wearing borrowed shoes. I know how to stretch a budget and remember names and recognize when someone is lying about money." She paused. "I don't know how to," she stopped. "I've never had someone stay just because they wanted to." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "You've been here a year," he said. "Have I left?" She looked at him. "That," he said quietly, "is what staying looks like. It doesn't announce itself, it simply continues." She looked at this man who was terrible at saying things, and completely honest when he said them. And for the first time since she had arrived at Blackmere with nothing to recommend her but attention and precision, and the particular fierce composure of a woman who has survived everything else and intended to survive this too, she believed him. She didn't say anything. She reached across and took his hand. He turned it and held hers back with the quiet certainty of a man who has decided and does not require further discussion. They sat like that for a while. Outside, Blackmere Hall breathed around them 200 years of stone and history, and all the weight of everything that had been built and borrowed and repaired and rebuilt, and inside it, two people sat in the particular warmth of a decision that had been made slowly, honestly, and without performance. Rose looked at their hands on the desk where they had worked for a year. She thought, "I am not useful to him, I am necessary." She thought about what it meant to be necessary without being used. She thought it might take some time to fully understand. She was, for once, not in a hurry. 3 years is enough time for a house to become a home. It is also enough time for a person to become, quietly and without ceremony, someone they could not have imagined being when they arrived. Rose understood this on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 years after she had stepped out of a carriage onto Blackmere's gravel drive and begun counting things to steady her nerves. She was in the estate office, her estate office now. In the particular way that a room becomes yours when you have worked in it until midnight enough times that it carries the specific impression of you reviewing the spring tenant accounts when Mrs. Pennington knocked and entered with the expression she wore when something had happened that she considered significant. "The apprenticeship letters," the housekeeper said. She set a stack of correspondence on the desk. "They've all replied." Rose set down her pen. She picked up the first letter, then the second. Then she set them both down and looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the particular way she looked at things when she was allowing herself to feel something before returning to work. "All of them?" she said. "Every institution you wrote to, Miss Pennington said. "Fort confirmations." Rose looked at the letters. 12 charitable institutions across Yorkshire and the surrounding counties, agreeing to participate in the fund she had established 6 months ago, the Blackmere Apprenticeship and Education Fund for orphaned young women. Girls who would learn bookkeeping, household management, commercial correspondence, practical arithmetic, the precise, unglamorous, load-bearing skills that nobody had thought to give them, because nobody had thought to ask what happened to girls after the charity kept them alive. She had asked. She had been the question for 27 years. She had finally decided she could also be part of the answer. "Write to each of them," Rose said. "Thank them. Ask each institution to identify the first cohort of candidates by end of April." She paused. "And write separately to Mrs. Hartwell at the Thornwick Institution. Tell her I'll come in person." Of course. Mrs. Pennington started to leave. "And tell His Grace," Rose added. "He'll want to know." The housekeeper smiled a small, real smile, the kind that had taken about 8 months to emerge and was now one of the things Rose considered among Blackmere's reliable pleasures. "He already does," Mrs. Pennington said. "He asked about the letters at breakfast." Rose looked at the door after she left. 3 years, she thought. Nathaniel Ashbourne asking after letters about orphan girls at breakfast. She picked up her pen. She went back to the accounts. The Blackmere estate accounts for the 3rd year of her tenure told a story in numbers. And Rose had always been better at reading numbers than most people were at reading words. The story they told was this: the tenant housing repairs that had begun in the first spring were complete. 17 families on the eastern farmland had roofs that no longer admitted rain. The grain storage facility rebuilt after the incident with the damp shipment that Julian had wielded against her. What felt like a different lifetime ago was weatherproof and properly ventilated. The household staff was fully paid on schedule, without the 7-month emergency fund improvisation that Mrs. Pennington had maintained in quiet desperation before Rose arrived. The debt structure that Crowther's 25-year scheme had concealed was visible now, fully audited. Fully documented, restructured under terms that Nathaniel had negotiated with 3 separate creditors over the course of 18 months. It was not gone. It would take another 7 years to clear entirely. But it was honest. Every number meant what it said. Rose had a particular feeling about honest numbers that she had never quite been able to explain to anyone who hadn't spent their childhood in an accounts office. Honest numbers were not comfortable. They were frequently unpleasant. But they were trustworthy, and trustworthy was the most important thing a number could be. Because a number you could trust was a problem you could solve. She was halfway through the spring projections when Nathaniel came in. He did not knock. He had stopped knocking approximately 14 months ago. And she had stopped noticing the absence of it approximately 13 months ago, which she considered a reasonable adjustment period. He came in, looked at the stack of correspondence, picked up the top letter, read 2 lines and set it back down. 12, he said. 12, he sat in the chair across from her. "When do you want to visit Thornwick?" "End of the month," she said. "Before the spring planting demands your full attention." He nodded. "I'll come with you." She looked up. "I know I don't need to." He held her gaze with the steady, uncomplicated certainty that had become the primary register of his affection. "I want to." She held his gaze for a moment, then she went back to the projections. "The Eastern Drainage contract," she said. "The legitimate one, the one we commissioned after the audit. The final payment is due in June. I've arranged it. And the Harwick successor firm? The one Beatrice's father identified? Settled in January." "I told you in January, I know. I like to verify. You verify everything 3 times. And we've had no further fraudulent drainage contracts," she said mildly. He almost smiled. Point taken. They worked in the same room for another hour, she on the household accounts, he on the agricultural contracts for the summer season, in the specific comfortable silence that had become, Rose thought, one of the things she valued most in the world. Not because it was dramatic or romantic in the conventional sense, but because it was real. Because it was 2 people who trusted each other enough to be quiet together, which was a rarer thing than most people understood. She thought about the night she had placed her wedding ring on his desk. She thought about what it had taken to do that, the composure of a woman who had decided that dignity was the one thing she would not surrender, even when everything else was being taken, and what it had taken to watch him push it back. She thought about all the things that had happened between that night and this quiet Tuesday morning in March. She turned a page in the accounts. She was home. The visit to Thornwick came on the last Thursday of the month. Rose did not wear diamonds. She wore a traveling dress in dark green wool, good quality, well-made, immaculate, and her hair arranged simply. And the silver brooch that had belonged to Nathaniel's great-aunt, which she wore for every occasion that mattered. Nathaniel drove. He could have sent a coachman. He drove anyway, which was the kind of thing he did now. Small, undramatic choices that said everything he was not particularly good at saying in words. The Thornwick Charitable Women's Institution was a building Rose knew from the inside of memory rather than the outside of distance. She had walked its corridors 10,000 times. She knew which floorboards creaked, which window in the accounts office let in a draft in winter, which of the cooks had a heavy hand with salt, and which of the supervisors had been quietly skimming the food budget since before Rose arrived, and would likely continue to do so until someone who knew what to look for arrived to stop it. She knew, before she stepped out of the carriage, that she would see that building differently today than she had ever seen it before. She was right. Mrs. Hartwell met them at the door. She was a small woman with bright eyes and the organized energy of someone who had managed a charitable institution on insufficient funds for 20 years and had developed a very precise sense of what a resource looked like. She looked at Rose, she said. Rose had been a duchess for 3 years. She was still slightly surprised, each time, by the title in the mouths of people who had known her as something else. Mrs. Hartwell, she said, "Thank you for having us." They went inside. The first thing Rose noticed was the smell. Beeswax and coal and the particular institutional warmth of a building heated by necessity rather than comfort. She had spent 23 years breathing that smell without noticing it. Now she noticed it the way you notice the quality of air when you have been somewhere better and returned. The second thing she noticed was the girls, 14 of them, arranged in the large common room with the careful posture of young women who have been told that important visitors are coming and that behavior reflects on the institution. Between 12 and 17 years old, Rose estimated. Some of them were trying not to look curious. Most of them were failing. Rose looked at them. She thought about being 12 years old in this room, or a room exactly like it, and having someone come in and look at you the way important people looked at institutions assessingly. From a distance, with the particular expression of people who see a category rather than a collection of individuals. She stepped forward. "Good morning," she said to the room. Not to Mrs. Hartwell, not to the supervisors lined up along the wall. To the girls. "I grew up in a place very much like this one." She paused. "I want to tell you about some opportunities that are coming. And I want to hear from you what you're good at, because that is going to matter more than you currently believe." The room went from the stiff silence of performed behavior to a different kind of silence. The silence of people who have been seen. A girl in the second row, 13, perhaps 14, with the sharp attentive eyes of someone who misses nothing, raised her hand. "What kind of opportunities?" Rose smiled. "The useful kind," she said. She spent 2 hours in that room. She talked about bookkeeping. She talked about household management. She talked about commercial correspondence and the specific power of being the person in any room who understands where the money goes. She answered questions with the directness she had wished someone had offered her at that age. Which was completely, without talking down, without the particular softening that institutions deployed when they were afraid that truth would be too much for young people to manage. She was not afraid of that. She had been a young person in an institution. She knew that what young people in institutions needed was not softening. It was information. It was the radical equalizing, life-changing experience of being told exactly what the world works like and exactly which skills would allow you to navigate it. When she was done, Mrs. Hartwell walked them back to the entrance. "They'll remember today for a long time," the older woman said quietly. "I hope they remember the content," Rose said. "The visit." "Both, Mrs. Hartwell said firmly. "You came back. That matters as much as anything you told them." Rose considered that. She thought about coming back. She thought about what it meant to an institution, to the people in it, when someone who had left returned not to demonstrate their escape, but to reach a hand backward into the room they had come from. She had not planned to feel this much about it. She felt it anyway. Nathaniel was waiting by the carriage. He looked at her face when she came out. He said nothing. He handed her in and took his own seat, and they drove back toward Blackmere in the comfortable quiet that was their particular language. And after about 10 minutes, Rose said, "We need to do this at more institutions." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I've already written to 2 others." She looked at him. "While you were inside," he said. She looked at him for another moment. "You are sometimes infuriating," she said. "So I've been told." He kept his eyes on the road. "Frequently by the same person." She faced forward. She was smiling. The summer brought a formal dinner at Blackmere that would have been 3 years ago. Impossible to imagine. Lydia arrived from Bath with a man named Thomas Ellery, quiet, steady, a second son with modest income and impeccable character, who looked at Lydia the way people look at things they can't quite believe they get to keep. He was not a strategic match. He was not what Octavia would have designed. He was someone Lydia had met at a friend's house in February, had written to Rose about in March, with the specific tone of someone who is trying to sound casual and is not succeeding, and had brought home in July with the expression of a person who has made a decision and would like the world to catch up. Rose had corresponded with Lydia more in the past 18 months than in the entire previous year combined. The correspondence had begun with practical matters, the Bath trip, the resources Rose had sent her on household finance and estate management, the books, and had slowly, incrementally become something else. Not quite friendship. Something more honest than friendship. Perhaps because it was built entirely from choice rather than proximity. The dinner was not an announcement. Lydia had been clear about that. "It's not an announcement, Rose. Stop planning the arrangements." Rose had been arranging quietly anyway, because that was the kind of person she was. Thomas Ellery, at dinner, demonstrated 2 things. A genuine working knowledge of agricultural improvement, which produced a conversation with Nathaniel that lasted most of the first course, and an entirely sincere interest in what Lydia was saying at all times, which Rose considered both more important and more telling. Octavia watched him across the table. She watched him the way she watched everything now, assessingly. Precisely, but with something different underneath the assessment. Rose had noticed it over the past year. The quality of Octavia's watching had changed. She still watched, but she was watching for different things. Where before she had been looking for failure, now she was looking for Rose had spent some time trying to name it meaning. She was looking for what things meant rather than whether they measured up. It was a subtle change. It was enormous. After dinner, when the men had gone to the library and Lydia had disappeared to find the book she'd left in the morning room, Octavia and Rose sat alone in the drawing room with their tea. "He's in love with her," Octavia said. "Yes," Rose agreed. "He has no useful connections and limited income." "Yes. She is happy." The words came out with the particular quality of something that has been held carefully and is being set down with equal care. "I've not seen her happy, and she has been performing contentment for some years." "This is different." "It is," Rose said. Octavia looked at her teacup. "You told me at Christmas 3 years ago that Lydia was her own to decide." "I did. I was furious." A pause. "I was furious because you were correct. And being correctly challenged by someone I had chosen to dismiss is not a comfortable experience." Rose said nothing. She had learned with Octavia that silence was more productive than filling it. "I want to ask you something," Octavia said. "You may decline to answer." "All right. Do you think I am capable of change?" The question landed in the room with a weight that Rose had not expected. She looked at Octavia, this woman who had laughed at a dinner table 3 years ago, who had worn black to a wedding, who had tried to use a family Christmas as an inspection, and found herself outmaneuvered not by cleverness but by simple competence. Who had asked, "Do you hate me?" in a quiet room and received an honest answer. Who had, at a formal dinner 8 months ago, silenced a dismissive remark about Rose's parentage with 4 words and then changed the subject. "I think," Rose said carefully, "that you have already changed." I think the question you're actually asking is whether I've noticed. Octavia looked at her. I've noticed, Rose said. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something that has been a long time coming and has finally arrived at a place where both people in the room can acknowledge it without either of them having to say more than is true. Octavia set down her cup. The young woman, she said. The one you're funding at the Thornwick Institution. The one in the apprenticeship program. Rose waited. She wrote to me, Octavia said. Rose went still. A letter, Octavia continued. Apparently, she was assigned to write a formal letter of correspondence as part of her training. And she was told to choose a recipient of significance, a pause. She chose me. Rose did not speak, wrote Octavia said. To thank the Duchess of Blackmere's family for the program. And she wrote that she had heard that the Duchess had grown up in a place like hers. And she wanted to know if that was true, because if it was the most useful thing anyone had ever told her. Octavia's voice was entirely level. She said that knowing it changes what she believes is possible. The fire. The clock, Rose's hands very still in her lap. It's true, Rose said quietly. I know it is. I wrote back to her. Rose looked up. I told her, Octavia said, that in my experience, the most capable people in any house are very rarely the ones who were born expecting it to belong to them. Rose looked at this woman proud. Difficult, wrong in so many ways for so long, and now, here, doing the hard and unglamorous work of being less wrong, and felt something she had not expected to feel and could not have predicted 3 years ago. She felt grateful, not for the cruelty, not for the empty chair or the black dress or the years of it. Grateful for this, the particular weight of a moment when someone who doubted you stops doubting. And you are there to see it. That was generous, Rose said. It was accurate, Octavia said. Then, with the smallest possible curve at the corner of her mouth, generosity and accuracy are occasionally the same thing. You taught me that. Rose was quiet for a moment. Then I think Lydia should marry Thomas Ellery. I know you do. Do you? Octavia picked up her cup. She looked at it for a long moment. Yes, she said. Simply, without qualifier, Rose nodded. They drank their tea. The formal announcement came 3 weeks later, at a small gathering that Rose had not, this time, been told was a gathering until the day before. Lydia had apparently consulted Nathaniel, who had consulted Mrs. Pennington, who had arranged everything with the efficient invisibility of a housekeeper who had spent 30 years making things happen without anyone noticing the mechanism. Rose had laughed when she found out. You all conspired, she said to Nathaniel. Mrs. Pennington conspired, he said. I merely approved. You approved a conspiracy. It's more accurate to say I failed to prevent one. She had looked at him with the particular exasperation that she had come to understand, one of the primary languages of a happy marriage. The gathering was small and warm and entirely different from the dinner 3 years ago, where 23 people had turned in silence and decided, in the space of 30 seconds, what Rose Mercer was worth. Lydia, at dinner, laughed at something Thomas said. A real laugh, unguarded, unperformed, the laugh of someone who has stopped monitoring themselves for a moment and simply responded. She looked across the table at Rose as she was still laughing. Rose raised her glass slightly, just enough. Lydia held her gaze. Something passed between them that would have been impossible to name and was entirely clear. 3 years, Rose thought. She had arrived in Thessamel with a borrowed ring that didn't fit, and an empty chair and the specific composure of a woman who had survived everything and intended to survive this too. She had not at the time imagined thriving. She was reconsidering that. Late September, a Tuesday evening, and Blackmere Hall was quiet the way it was quiet when the day's business was finished and the house had exhaled. Rose was in the estate office. She was closing the final ledger of the autumn accounts. The harvest numbers, the tenant receipts, the staff wages, the maintenance costs of a 200-year-old house that was, for the first time in a very long time, being maintained properly when Nathaniel came in. He looked at the ledger in her hands. He reached across and took it. She held on for a fraction of a second before letting go, which was pure instinct. Blackmere survived for centuries before you, he said. Poorly, she said immediately. He laughed. It was not a polite laugh. Not the controlled half-smile she had catalogued in the first months of their marriage. It was a real, unguarded laugh, the kind that comes from genuine pleasure. From being with someone who makes you forget to manage yourself. He took her hand and pulled her up from the desk. Come outside, he said. The accounts will be there tomorrow. She let him lead her out. The terrace was cold, a September night. The edge of autumn properly arrived, and the sky above Blackmere was the deep, generous dark of a house far enough from London that the stars were actually visible. Rose stood on the terrace with her husband's hand in hers and looked at the house behind them. She looked at the north wing, repaired now, its new plasterwork pale in the dark. She looked at the east wing, where 3 years ago she had been given the second-best guest room and a housemaid who spoke in monosyllables. She looked at the kitchen windows, warm and lit, where Mrs. Pennington was almost certainly reviewing tomorrow's breakfast arrangements with the particular dedication of a woman who had decided, 18 months ago, that this household was finally worth the full force of her 30 years of expertise. She looked at all of it. She had not 3 years ago allowed herself to think of this as home. She had allowed herself to think of it as a problem to be solved, a responsibility to be met, a practical arrangement that required competent management. She understood now that this had been, in its own way, a form of protection. If you do not call it home, it cannot be taken from you. If you do not love it, losing it cannot break you. She had spent a very long time not calling things what they were. Nathaniel said, "Do you ever wonder what your parents would think if they could see you now?" She had been asked this question before, in various forms. She had always deflected it. She had always found the deflection easier than the thing underneath it. She thought about it now honestly for the first time. She thought about 2 people she had never known, who had left an infant outside a charitable institution on a night she didn't remember. For reasons she would never know. She had spent 20 years being angry about that. In the particular silent way that children who have been taught that anger is ungrateful become angry quietly. And constantly, and without anywhere to put it. She had spent the last 3 years becoming, slowly and with considerable effort, a person who was no longer primarily defined by that night. No, she said. Nathaniel waited. I spent too many years wondering why someone left me, she said. I would rather think about the people who stayed. He held her hand tighter. She turned and looked at him, this difficult, reserved, genuinely good man who had pulled out a chair for her when no one else would, who had pushed a ring back across a desk, who had sat beside her in a grain store and told her that making mistakes was proof of real work, who had asked after her at 5 in the morning in his own kitchen, who had driven to Thornwick himself and written 2 letters while she was inside, and who had told her, on a night that had nearly broken everything, that she was not useful to him, that she was necessary, that there was a difference. She understood now fully what the difference was. Useful things can be replaced when better ones become available. Necessary things are the ones the structure rests on. Remove them and nothing else holds. She looked at Blackmere Hall behind her, not as a palace she had been fortunate enough to enter, not as a problem she had been assigned to solve, but as a home they had rebuilt together from the accounts up, stone by stone and number by number, through ruined grain and forged documents and midnight ledgers and every argument where neither of them was entirely right. A home where she did not have to earn her place every morning. A home where people stayed. She stood on that terrace in the September dark, with her husband's hand in hers and the stars above Blackmere finally visible. And she understood completely, at last, without reservation, that she had not merely survived the room they had laughed her into. She had made it worth living in, and that was a thing no pedigree could give. No cruelty could take, and no amount of empty chairs could ever again diminish. She had built it herself, and it would stand.